Out Tara Lynn in the back there in the green. She's waving. Everybody say hi to Tara Lynn.
Hi, everybody.
She's from History Fix. How many of you all, by show of hands, have a subscription to History Fix? I do. A couple people. Okay. Yeah, History Fix is basically like a Netflix, but just with history stuff. You don't have to mess with all the drama TV shows or anything on there. It's got documentaries, short films, how-tos, all ranging from the 1st to 21st century. I mean, how many videos and films are on there now, Tarlin?
We have more than 700.
More than 700. This was a really grassroots effort to start and bring history content to the screens and living rooms of all you folks here. You can join today. You can visit Tarlin in the back, and you can enjoy History Fix programs that benefit the SVBF, the Battlefields Foundation here. So with every subscription, annual subscription, if you sign up today for History Fix, History Fix will give $5 back to the Battlefields Foundation. And you also save 30% off your normal price if you use the discount code 30% off. Tarlin has all that information in the back. I highly recommend it. All those great National Park Service documentaries, they've all replaced now, like the Fredericksburg one, the Antietam one. Those are all on there. I watch those on repeat. Takes me back to the good old days. Just those great old school before I was born, those films. But Tara Lynn's back there. Please see her, get some information, sign up for History Fix today, bring history to life in your living room. That's History Fix. I'm now going to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Jon Tracey. Jon Tracey is a public historian and also works in the field of historic preservation and memory. He holds a BA in history from Gettysburg College and a master's from West Virginia University. Jon has experience preserving and interpreting historic sites, and he's a published author and editor through the Emerging Civil War series and other platforms. But Jon is probably the hardest working man I know at a National Park Service site. Jon, it's the Historian and Cultural Resource Program Manager at Cedar Creek Belle Grove National Historical Park. Jon is a key member of their staff, but not only that, he's really an important part of our relationship as the Battlefields Foundation, the managing entity of the National Historic District that Congress created just almost 30 years ago. We work with our partners, including Cedar Creek Belle Grove National Historical Park, and having a partner like them, but having staff at that site like Jon is such an important thing. And Jon's a good friend of the Battlefields Foundation, a good friend of Civil War history here in this area, and I'm so glad that he's on our panel today to speak. And without further ado, we'll hand it over to Jon Tracey.
Hi folks, you might notice that this is a slight shakeup from the published list, and for that I want to thank Terry and Scott for the last minute shuffle there. Recently I had a dear friend of mine kind of light the emergency beacon, so I'm going straight from this to Dulles to fly out west to help him out. So quick shuffle up there, but I will not leave until everyone has asked their Berryville questions. So you've got wiggle room, so don't feel like you can't ask any questions. Now, I'm a little, I'm warming up here still because I'm getting stared down by Greg Mertz. Greg was my supervisor at my second ever national park that I worked at 8 years ago when I was 20, and I'm rocking the Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. And he holds a fantastic interpretive training, and now he's here auditing my program 8 years out, and it is no less terrifying than when he did it the very first time. But yes, I work for the National Park Service here in the Shenandoah Valley, just a little south of here in Middletown, where the National Park Service and many partner organizations, especially the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation, we all work together to preserve and interpret that landscape, including the 1864 Battle of Cedar Creek, and it has been fantastic seeing the work being done at that Miller House that you all were shown earlier today. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is the beginning of September 1864 and the Battle of Berryville. Move on to here. The great news is that this map is blown up in your booklets that you all received because it's a fantastic way to just look at how everybody is running up and down the valley in the summer of 1864. But we are going to be zoomed in on number 4 here, Berryville. It's about 10 miles east of where we are in Winchester. So throughout all these campaigns, as you've seen through all of the fantastic presentations today, everybody's putting some pretty serious mileage on their broken on this campaign. And Berryville has seen some pretty serious mileage run through it for much of the Civil War as well. There are some signs there marking where Confederate camps are in the 1863 Gettysburg campaign. There is a lot of irregular activity in and around Berryville as well. And as we move into the summer of 1864, we start seeing Union cavalry camped around it at the end of August into the beginning of September. So up to this point, we've had all of this back and forth that you heard on the bus tour, and we'll probably see more of on tomorrow's tour. Now, Early is stretched on a pretty significant front with not a whole lot of men to cover that. And while Sheridan has more men, up to this point, he has been reluctant to force full-scale engagements. And part of that, as Scott mentioned in the previous talk, again, you have to see everything that is happening in the summer and fall of 1864 as being seen through the lens of the 1864 presidential election. And so Sheridan, when he is given this command in the Shenandoah Valley, is basically explicitly told not to mess anything up. Now, granted, every military commander is told not to lose, but it seems that Sheridan is told it in slightly more forceful tones than usual. And so he is being very, very cautious for fear of these political ramifications. But now, in early September, we are starting to move across the line into Virginia. We are starting to move towards Berryville. On September 2nd, there's smaller engagements at Bunker Hill and Stevenson's Depot, again, that you'll learn about other times this weekend. And then we have Brigadier General Thorburn's United States Cavalry moving into Berryville proper, where they are going to stay from August 30th to September 2nd. But on the morning of the 3rd, the U.S. Cavalry in Berryville is going to leave. They're going to start heading south towards the town of White Post. Now, on the morning of the 3rd, there's going to be a small action near Gold's Farm with 2 companies of Mosby's troops and the 6th New York Cavalry a little to the southwest of Berryville. But the critical takeaway here is there had been United States Cavalry camped in Berryville for a few days. They are now leaving. So we start setting the stage for Berryville. We have a couple Confederates on the left here, a couple of Union commanders down in the right that I want to note. So the United States troops that are engaged in Berryville are basically entirely coming from Brigadier General George Crook's Army of West Virginia, which we've heard some of the various commands there throughout the day. So we're talking about 7,000 infantry soldiers there. We are also hinging around Colonel Joseph Thoburn. And some of you have probably attended my talks where I preach the gospel of Colonel Joseph Thoburn, though I will say that his division does not have a particularly good day at Berryville. We also have, coming into play a little later, is going to be Colonel Rutherford B. Hayes, future president, and at this point, brigade commander, not in Thoburn's division, but in Isaac Duvall's 2nd Division. Over on the left, we've got our key Confederate players. Up top, we've got Lieutenant General Richard H. Anderson. He is in the Shenandoah Valley, and he is serving with Early. He is not serving under Early. And they are both very mad about everything to do with that situation. And that's going to come into play towards the end stages of Berryville as well. So he's operating in a separate command with about 3,700 troops, including Kershaw's infantry division there, some artillery, and some cavalry. And so what we're really going to be zoning in on for this engagement at Berryville is Anderson's command, mostly Kershaw's division, and Thoburn's division of the United States. That moves us to this great Hal Jesperson map, where you can see we've got Anderson, we've got Kershaw, we've got Thoburn's division down here, and Berryville is just a smidge off this map there. Another map I'll show later will show this line of battle in relation to Berryville proper. So it is the morning of September 3rd, 1864. With the departure of the United States Cavalry, Berryville is empty. George Crook is going to come with the Army Army of West Virginia, start moving down into Berryville. They're going to deploy Thoburn's division out up here with a picket line all the way in the top left corner of the map there. And Duvall's division, including Hayes, camping a little closer to the town of Berryville proper. Now, at the same time, we go back to Anderson. Now, Anderson knows that the U.S. cavalry has left Berryville, so he thinks that this road is wide open. He doesn't know that the Army of West Virginia is coming in. And so Anderson is going to leave Winchester and start coming in towards Berryville. Now, this is where we start seeing, I quote quite a few times from Anderson's report of his services in 1864 that he files at the end of that year, which photocopies of which were provided to me by Ryan, which was a real help. Now, he writes that as he is preparing to make this movement, that, quote, "It's seeming to me to be useless to remain in this position when the enemy declined an engagement and we could not compel one. I propose crossing the Blue Ridge on to Loudoun County." And so he is planning on going through this opening in Berryville, heading out into Loudoun County, maybe stirring up some trouble there, and potentially, though he doesn't say it very clearly, potentially he's hoping to just keep going all the way back to Richmond and Petersburg because he's real tired of this whole Shenandoah Valley, Jubal A thing. And so theoretically, he's trying to leave through what he thinks is an opening to Loudoun County. But at around 4:30, instead, he runs into a U.S. infantry picket that is not going to last very long. That line is going to be composed mostly of the 1st West Virginia and the 2nd Maryland Eastern Shore off to the northeast of town. They're going to plow through that pretty quickly and start moving towards the rest of Thoburn's division. They're going to break off Brigadier General Benjamin Humphrey's Mississippi Brigade off to the U.S. left flank, while we have Rutherford's South Carolinians and Sims's Georgians that are basically just going to go straight at the U.S. lines here. That's the plan. Thoburn's pickets are going to get pushed back, and the division is going to form on what you see mapped here, which is alternatively described as some kind of earthworks. They were probably not originally built by Thoburn's men. They seem to they're described as old Confederate earthworks that got thrown up in one of the many other movements up and down the valley, and Thoburn's men are just going to use them for whatever they're worth. A soldier from the 1st West Virginia said that the, quote, "the earthworks were hardly to be dignified by that name, not being over 2 or 3 feet high and affording very little protection." On the other side of that argument, a South Carolinian writing about the battle said that it was a, quote, "formidable breastwork behind which bristled the bright bayonets." But that same account also said that the U.S. position there had fortified artillery in the earthwork, which is just not correct either. So those are kind of the two perspectives on what that small line of earthworks looks like. So Thoburn is going to bring up the rest of that 1st Brigade that had its regiments on picket. So he's bringing up the 11th West Virginia, 123rd Ohio, and the 15th West Virginia. And as he is doing that, they see, hey, there's Confederates over there. They're on the flank. That's bad, because Thoburn's a pretty good military commander, and he can catch that pretty obvious fact pretty quickly. So we also have some of Kershaw's artillery battalions setting up again, kind of almost on the flank of Thoburn's command. Crook is going to order the rest of Thoburn's division up in the front. You see some of them deploying off on the right-hand side there. And the goal here is to just have Thoburn's division park itself in place, because Thoburn's division and Kershaw's division are roughly equal in the sheer number of infantry muskets on hand. So Crook's hope is we're just going to park Thoburn's entire division here. They're going to stall out the Confederate position, and then we're going to move the 2nd Division under Isaac Duvall. The rest of the Army of West Virginia will come up around the flank of the Confederates and sweep them off the field, and then everything's fine. So that's Crook's plan, but the Confederates are going to move so quickly that that plan will not last very long at all. So the Confederates are very quickly going to slam into Thoburn's position, very quickly creating and exploiting gaps in the line. Some of them are going to hit before the reinforcements even get up to the line, so you start seeing Thoburn's men retreating through their reinforcements. Things get pretty chaotic pretty quickly, and all of Thoburn's division is going to be routed back towards Berryville by about 6 p.m. Thoburn himself writes in his apparatchik report, quote, "It is with mortification that I report the giving way of the command on the left. The men and officers feel their disgrace and also believe themselves capable of doing better things." And that's what gets printed in those official records. So that's a pretty damning account of him saying, like, yep, that was a problem, and everybody here knows that we can do better. So that moves us to our phase 2 map, also a great map by Hal Jesperson here. So Duval's troops had initially been camped closer to Berryville, but once the battle starts in earnest, they are going to be told to pack up their camp and start getting to where the 1st Division is. And so they're going to be doing that, and Russell Hastings of the 23rd Ohio wrote that, quote, "It was a laughable sight to see the line of battle formed with nearly every man holding a tin cup of coffee in hand, chewing and munching crackers and bacon." The Army of West Virginia doesn't get to finish a lot of meals in the fall 1864 campaign. They seem to keep getting interrupted every time they stop. And as they deploy along the road, they're going to realize that the plan to get around the Confederate flank is not going to happen anymore. Instead, they're going to be directed almost directly forward, again, through Thoburn's retreating troops, to just try to retake and hold the positions that Thoburn's troops had originally held. And this is where we get future President Rutherford B. Hayes front and center, because his brigade is going to be doing the brunt of the fighting in our phase 2. Moving towards the center of the line along a stone wall. So Mississippians and South Carolinians, they're going straight forward. They're chasing Thoburn's men through the Rosemont property, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, towards this wall. Returning to Russell Hastings, he remembered Thoburn's men ran through our ranks to the rear in safety, our boys jeering them as they went by in a panic-stricken fear. Hayes will move his troops forward, they will crouch down behind a stone wall, and they will wait for the Confederates to come to them. And once they get close, the West Virginians and Ohioans under Hayes' command will all stand up behind the wall together and fire a volley directly into the advancing Confederates. And the Confederates will withdraw back to those earthworks. Again, lots of back and forth with those earthworks, whether they were big earthworks or small earthworks. And Humphreys himself will be pretty badly wounded, and the Union troops are going to be sweeping forward. When Hastings writes again, when the Confederate line was not more than 100 feet away, our boys gave them a murderous volley, and Hayes, jumping the wall, called the charge, which was taken up with a rousing cheer. The Confederates halted but an instant, then turned and ran, our boys after them. So that's our core of the fighting here. Well, simultaneously, to the north end of the road, we have some other action where Sims's Georgians have been advancing. We'll see the Confederates on their flank being pushed back, and then they will stop their advance and start to kind of find better positions, rather than trying to sweep the significantly smaller Union troops in front of them. So here we have one of the 2 really great sketches of the Battle of Berryville that come from James Taylor, a sketch artist who a lot of you, I'm sure, have seen quite a bit of work in the Shenandoah Valley. What we see here is what I believe to be that section of fighting to the north of the road. So you see our line of U.S. troops down here, and then looking up to the ridge, we have old red breastworks. And so we can kind of get a look at how this fight is looking like as we start to move into 7 o'clock after the U.S. counterattack. And this is what Scott Patchen calls in his book, quote, a twilight standoff, because what we have shown in the sketch is basically everybody sitting here in the dark behind ridge lines or whatever those earthworks might or might not have been, firing pot shots back and forth at each other long until after the sun sets, basically until they are stopped by a coming of a rainstorm. One soldier wrote, dark coming on, no further movement was made, only holding our line with constant rifle fire until 10 p.m. when the firing on both sides ceased. Union troops will rotate on and off the line on occasion, get a breather, resupply their ammunition, go back up, continue this back and forth skirmishing with the Confederates on the slopes above them. So as we wrap up September 3rd into the early hours of September 4th, we have another site that might be familiar to many of you that study the Shenandoah Valley. We've got a Hotchkiss now. And so here we see Berryville down along the side here. We can see where the bulk of the fighting is happening up in here. And we can also see what this looks like as the rest of the Union and Confederate troops pour into the region to try to stabilize things in the hours after that combat. We see the Union line extending all the way north along the road here, and we see the arrival of Confederates along this side here. So Sheridan will arrive on the field of battle in the evening of the 3rd, and his initial orders are to order the Army of West Virginia to retreat back towards Berryville. But again, as they're engaged in the dark, and then it's too dark and it's raining and they can't move, so the Army of West Virginia is going to be camped out on those earthworks for the rest of the night before they can fulfill that order. He's going to withdraw that Union cavalry that had gone south of Berryville. He's recalling them back, just like, okay, stop what you're doing, don't go south anymore, pull back, we need you closer to the rest of the army until we can figure out what is going on and what's in front of us. And Sheridan is again going to default into these defensive mindsets. At the same time, Early's command is moving out to Berryville to support Anderson. Now Anderson, again, writes some very angry things because various things, including that rainstorm, will delay Early's arrival on the field. And Anderson is going to go off on Early saying, you know, what if Sheridan attacked me this morning before you were up? I would have been just wiped off the field without any help. And Early basically goes, yeah, but he didn't, so. Again, not a great co-worker relationship there. So Early and Anderson, even with that belated arrival, are still thinking about renewing the offensive and attacking the Union position until they spend a little time and see just how far Sheridan's command is extending off to the flank. And they're going to go, okay, you know, maybe continuing the offensive is not such a great plan. And by the evening of September 4th, they're going to start making their way back towards Winchester again. Now Sheridan still thinks that there's a Confederate attack coming. He writes a letter on the evening of September 4th that, quote, today has been spent on both sides without any results. The indications look to an engagement tomorrow. But there is no engagement on September 5th. He wakes up to find that the Confederates have left in a reasonably speedy manner, leaving their dead and wounded behind on the field. Anderson, still mad at Jubal Early, abandons this plan to move to Loudoun County, returns to Winchester, but also kind of writes off another snarky note saying, there seemed to be no necessity for Kershaw's division remaining longer in the valley, and spends the next week again preparing to leave back towards Petersburg and Richmond. So moving to the casualties of the battle as we move into the reporting and the aftermath. The Army of West Virginia loses about 23 killed, under 24 wounded, and 19 missing for 166 casualties per George Crook's report. Most of those casualties are coming from Colonel Joseph Thoburn's division. And while this battle is smaller in the scale of numbers involved than a lot of the things we're familiar with in the 64 campaign, there are still corners of this fight that get very nasty very quickly. For example, the 36th Ohio has the same amount of casualties at Berryville as they do at the 3rd Battle of Winchester. And I think that's worth kind of pointing out. Confederate casualties are higher. Again, they're on the offensive for the majority of the battle. And they're placed around 230 or so. Most of that's coming from Humphrey's command as well. Crook reports that of that, he captures about 60. Those of you who have seen us speak about Winchester National Cemetery, its creation, and some of the interments there are perhaps not surprised to see a slide that ties that research into the Battle of Berryville. Sometimes I've presented some of that information at SVBF conferences. And so some of those stories I want to highlight. We're going to start with Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy is represented by the two photos on the right-hand side, one being a cemetery headstone, and the other being the cover page of the widow's pension that his wife filed. He had been born in Pittsylvania County, Virginia, way down south in the state of Virginia there. But by 1860, he had moved into another part of Virginia, now West Virginia, to the town of Cerrito, which was a major abolitionist colony set up to try to prove the efficiency of free labor and free men even in the South. From there, he will join what begins as the 5th Virginia Infantry, becomes the 5th West Virginia, and he leaves behind his wife, Elizabeth, when he is killed at the Battle of Berryville. She files for the pension. Working through the pension file, finds that their first son, named after him, was born October 1st, about a month after his father was killed at Berryville. He'd been home for re-enlistment leave earlier in 1864. On the left-hand side, represented by his headstone and the consent in case of minor form, is Charles Simpson, who was born in Ohio, joins the 9th West Virginia in 1864. This paperwork was from his service record because when he wanted to go and enlist over in Charleston, he had to bring his dad along to verify. It says that he's 18, he was probably more like 16 or 17, but he had to bring his dad along to fill out that paperwork to say, I'm aware of what's going on and I authorize my minor son to join the United States Army. The two of them, Hardy and Simpson, are buried near the battlefield at Berryville and removed to Winchester National Cemetery in 1866 and 1867. Here in the center is the headstone of Jacob Rosenbaum, a printer who joined the 13th Mississippi at the beginning of the war, had been previously wounded at the Battle of Malvern Hill. He's mortally wounded at Berryville, dies on September 8th, and was ultimately reburied in Stonewall Cemetery, the Confederate Cemetery in Winchester. Next to him is the paperwork for Sergeant Robert D. Waldrop, 41 years old, 5'10", with dark complexion and gray eyes. He was a farmer that had joined the 3rd South Carolina. His records are 50-50 as to whether or not he was killed at the Battle of Berryville and removed from the field, or mortally wounded and dying September 8th, somewhere in a hospital in Winchester. Writing all the way later in 1921, one of Waldrop's comrades in the 3rd South Carolina bitterly recalled the Battle of Berryville, noting that at the time of Waldrop's death, the enemy had been in almost total retreat. As one last personal story, at Captain James Selby at 36 Ohio, you might notice that in this reprinted CEV, he is missing his right arm. He loses his arm in the aftermath of the Battle of Missionary Ridge. And after losing his arm, he, quote, had his sword changed to a left-hand weapon and returned to the front. And he is with the Army of West Virginia at the Battle of Berryville, where he was wounded on September 3rd, ultimately suffering a second amputation, losing his right leg, and dying in a hospital in Annapolis, Maryland on September 14th. His mother claimed that he was her sole source of support because her husband had died, and receives a pension beginning in 1865 for her son's service. However, as this newspaper article talks about, at some point in 1878, that pension gets canceled because, quote, it is alleged that persons who were her enemies concocted a story that she was wealthy and not in need of a pension. This newspaper article is publicizing an appeal to the local representative in the House of Representatives to move forward a bill to reinstate her pension for the death of her son. Her pension is restored by 1890, somewhere in there, for about $20 a month. How is the Battle of Berryville reported on? What do things look like in this immediate aftermath in early September until we get to the real kickoff of that fall campaign and constant movement following the Third Battle of Winchester? Again, this is all tied up in the 1864 presidential election. That's why Sheridan had been cautious up to this point. At the very end of August, so just a couple days prior, the Democratic Convention is meeting in Chicago where they will select George McClellan to be the presidential candidate. Now, the party platform set forth by the Democratic Party on August 29th called for, quote, the immediate efforts be made for cessation of hostilities. Though McClellan immediately tries to walk back from that promise, leading to some splits internal to the party. But this is all happening all at the same time. But simultaneously, at the same time as news from Berryville makes its way across the United States, they are also getting news about the fall of Atlanta to Sheridan's army. And maybe that is lifting some of the pressure off of Sheridan. So here we have some clippings from newspapers published in the first 2 weeks of 1964. And you can see the Battle of Berryville is getting quite a bit of coverage, sometimes in the same billing as the fall of Atlanta. So while we may not think a whole lot about Berryville now, it's getting some attention at the time as things start to speed up in the lower valley. You see it in the same headlines as Atlanta, as Mobile. And, well, you could look at Berryville as a draw. At the end of the day, Union troops got attacked by Kershaw's division, and not only did they not be pushed off the field, they counterattacked through, stopped the advance, and ultimately forced the Confederates to withdraw back towards Winchester. So in the scale of engagements in the Shenandoah Valley, that's looking pretty reasonably good. The Indianapolis Star accused Sheridan of being too cautious, and that instead of digging in on the night of the 3rd into the morning of the 4th, that he should have just done an all-out offensive along that entire line. The New York Times trumped up the counterattack, calling it taking an entrenched Confederate earthwork. Again, there's technically earthworks there. That might have been a little bit of an exaggeration. But for the most part, a lot of this coverage in northern papers is pretty straightforward. A lot of the southern papers don't cover the battle in much detail, if at all. The Richmond Enquirer was adamant that, quote, there are no indications of retreat by Early. The Richmond Times-Dispatch complained of the absence of news from Early. Though the Charleston, South Carolina Daily Courier trumpeted their local soldiers, Kershaw's division, as driving 2 corps several miles onto a 3rd corps, when really they had pushed 1 division back into the 2nd division. But again, they wanted to trump up their local folks. But one of the more poignant summations of the 64 Valley campaign that is really spinning up the September actions here comes from the Charleston Mercury, when they printed news from Winchester that seemed awfully bleak. This is being published in between Berryville and 3rd Winchester. We never lie down to sleep with the certainty that we may not be aroused before daybreak to go forth to meet the enemy. We never sit down to a meal without feeling we may fight a battle before it is concluded. The demon of unrest haunts this valley. We have come back to Winchester, and I do not know why. I can form no idea of what we will do in the future. We cannot invade. And so there are a lot of Confederate soldiers that are like, okay, we poke out, we retreat to Winchester, we can't go north again. We tried going to DC, and we saw this morning the problems that they had doing that. Now, of course, very quickly in this period reporting, the smaller engagement at Berryville is going to get overshadowed by the rest of the fall Shenandoah Valley campaign that gets much larger in scale and numbers engaged and much more dramatic. So as we move into the coming days of September, we go back to maneuvering. Sheridan is watching very closely. We talked a little bit about interrogating prisoners of war. He's doing the same thing. Every time soldiers are captured, again, about 60 or 70 have been captured in Berryville. Hey, what commands are you from? Where are you going? Trying to get a feel, and then as they go through other cavalry actions, every time they pick up a command, they're basically trying to figure out, hey, has anybody left the valley to go to Petersburg? Has anybody showed up in the valley from Petersburg that we didn't know about? Trying to figure out who's where. And so he is eagerly waiting for any Confederates to leave for Petersburg, and on September 8th, he noted that these captured prisoners indicated that nobody had left, and quote, I had not deemed it best to attack it, but have watched closely to press him hard as soon as he commences to detach troops for Richmond. And the story of how Sheridan learns that Confederate troops have left the valley is actually tied back to Berryville and the local community there. Some of you have probably heard the stories of Thomas Laws and Rebecca Wright. Thomas Laws is an enslaved black man who lived near Berryville, who had the ability to travel through Confederate lines to sell goods in Winchester. He will be going back and forth between Sheridan's command and Winchester, and ultimately will deliver the news for Rebecca Wright when Kershaw's division had left the valley, opening things up for the Third Battle of Winchester now that Sheridan has received the news that what he had been waiting for, the departure of Confederate troops, had happened. And Laws lives out the rest of his life near Berryville and is buried just to the south of town. And so it's kind of this all tied together with Berryville. And so, yeah, the Confederate troops that had been engaged at Berryville will ultimately leave for a time. They will return after 3rd Winchester, but they'll be gone, and Sheridan will find all of that news he needs. And I think that, in a way, we see Berryville as a bit of a change. Sheridan is not aggressive at Berryville. I don't want to make it sound like that. But with the change in political situations and the push as he gets closer and waits for the Confederates to leave, we do start to see this shift into the more aggressive actions that he takes further on in the month of September. And so we move to the ways in which the Battle of Berryville was, or was not, remembered. It was sometimes remembered by veterans as the kickoff of the fall campaign in September, but that's only if it was remembered at all, which didn't always happen. In 1893, Captain Wiley Gardner Johnson wrote an article into the Confederate Veteran magazine where he mentioned Berryville, complaining that, quote, "No mention is made of the fight in any history of the war I have read." He had been there in Company C of the 18th Mississippi, and his account that he wrote in mostly talks about his time as a prisoner of war at Harper's Ferry and Johnson's Island, but he speaks of the Battle of Berryville, talking about his orderly being killed, and noted that when the command to withdraw from the Union counterattack was given, he didn't hear it, he failed to do so, and was captured during that counterattack. So to him, Battle of Berryville is a pretty memorable time. 2 future U.S. presidents also wrote about Berryville. During the 1876 election, Republicans heavily circulated papers from their candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes. There printed Hayes's 1865 farewell address that he delivered to his troops at the conclusion of the war. And in that address, Hayes listed and talks about the really big battles that they fought in, things like the 3rd Winchester. But he also urged them to remember, quote, the night battle at Berryville. 20 years later, in the 1896 presidential campaign of William McKinley, he too was thinking about the 64 Valley campaign. At the time, McKinley had been on George Crook's staff in the Army of West Virginia, so he's all around at this time. And in 1896, he's speaking to a Virginian voter from Harrisonburg. And there, McKinley praised the beauty of the valley landscape and regretted never having a chance to return after the Civil War. And when he talked about his experiences in the valley, he doesn't talk about Kernstown, Winchester, Cedar Creek. He talks about Berryville, saying, "I had some experiences I shall not forget. The battle at Berryville was fought after night. It was a short, severe, and brilliant affair." That's what he chose to talk about to that local valley voter. In the 1890s, the Confederate Veterans Group placed a series of markers across Clarke County, noting years of engagements the command engaged. And this is the marker that they will put up just outside the town of Berryville to mark this fight. But still, the smaller size of the fight easily overshadowed by things just to come, like 3rd Winchester and a number of other skirmishes that occur in and around Berryville, overshadowed by things like actions taken by Mosby's troops in August around Berryville. That's all going to overshadow a smaller fight with, 10,000 troops engaged combined, at most. But while Berryville has grown with residential encroachment, like places across the valley, some of the Berryville battlefield is still something you can go and travel to and understand the topography of the landscape. There's still, the road networks are mostly the same. The rural character, at least in the core of the battlefield, is still somewhat similar. Sims's brigade advanced along the fields of what is now the Clarke County High School. And much of the fighting occurs around Rosemont, a historic farm that is still present. The historic structures are there. A lot of the woodlots are similar in scope to what they would have been. Although the stone wall that Hayes will begin his counterattack from behind, that appears to be gone. I couldn't find it from the public right-of-ways when I went looking from the road. It's a popular wedding venue now where you can stay at the Hayes House or the McKinley House, where they have a series of guest rooms named after Civil War officers. And as we come to a conclusion here, I want to conclude with a few stories that never came to a clear conclusion. To borrow from local Valley historian and friend of mine, Jonathan Noyales, even a relatively small battle is momentous to those who are killed or wounded there, or to their families. And there are some stories here that never have an ending. Over here on the right, this photo is attributed to the Levi W. Bond of Company B of the 15th West Virginia. He goes missing on September 3rd at the Battle of Berryville. Some records say he's taken prisoner and then must have died in a POW camp. Some say that maybe he was killed straight out of the battle. Nobody knows. Nobody at the time knew, nobody knows now. And every so often, the family is still trying to figure out how exactly his story ended. This newspaper article here was printed in October of 1884, when 16-year-old Nettie Wilson wrote to this paper looking for information on her brother Harmon Wilson, Company F of the 36th Ohio, as her father would like to know the whereabouts or how he died, when and where buried. He was last seen during the skirmish at Berryville. And as kind of a note about the ways in which Berryville was or wasn't remembered, she gets things jumbled a little bit, because she writes that the fight at Berryville happened, quote, between Cedar Creek and Winchester. I went back through the casualty records and the paperwork. He's killed at the September 3rd Battle of Berryville, but her brothers, serving in the Army at the time, or in their retelling to her, get that timeline a little jumbled. Down here is another newspaper article from February of 1902, where Peter Williams of the 34th Ohio wrote of carrying a wounded soldier from Berryville off the battlefield, stating that he thinks that it was a soldier from the 15th West Virginia, and he wants to know what happened to the wounded soldier that he helped off the battlefield. Was he still alive? Did he recover because of the actions of Williams? He wants to know. The soldier had been wounded in the leg just below the knee. So I spent some time crawling through the 15th West Virginia files. We had 4 killed, 4 missing, and 20 wounded at the Battle of Berryville. And I found the following soldiers wounded in the leg specifically, not the ankle or thigh, but specifically enumerated as the leg. There was Alpheus Reese, who was wounded severely, spent the rest of the year in the hospital in Frederick, Maryland, but returned to service in 1865. Or John Newman, who had been slightly wounded and had no break in service, remained with the regiment the whole time. There are, of course, other West Virginian regiments that have plenty of soldiers that are wounded in the leg at the Battle of Berryville. Or Williams, or the newspapers, or the service records might have mixed up where the soldier was wounded. I found plenty of those. There were soldiers that one account said were wounded in the leg, and then I go back through their pension files and no, they were shot in the hand. And so I don't know if it was either of those 2 soldiers. That's just the best I could get at in the short time I had to dedicate to that. This shows the impact of the Battle of Berryville. 20 years later, family members wanted to know what happened to their missing brother. 30 years later, Confederate soldiers came back to Berryville to put up a stone marking the location of the battlefield. And nearly 40 years later, after the battle, the soldier wishes to hear stories of comrades and find closure to know what might have happened to someone he helped. I believe the Battle of Berryville is worth remembering, if even for no greater reason than some of these unfinished stories. Thank you.
Thank you for that great you said, I guess there were several troop movements during the war through Berryville. The last time that we had one of these great SVBF conferences, when it was over, I drove back Route 50 and I got out in Berryville and walked around. Like, what a cool little town. I'm about 2 blocks north of the main drag, and I come across this old post and it said, Robert E. Lee tethered traveler. Is that legit? And what would that have been for?
Yeah, I mean, so, like I mentioned, the Confederate Army certainly spent some time there as they move up towards the Gettysburg campaign.
Okay.
Whether or not that is the post that he tied to, or that is a post representing a post, I'm thinking of things like in West White Post, right, where it's like, oh, well, George Washington placed this survey marker, but that sucker gets hit by a car at least every 4 months. So we are on generation 45 posts. Anyway, yes, I am familiar with the signs. The Confederate Army certainly is spending some time up in there. Whether or not that is where travelers stood, your guess is as good as mine.
I approached recently Berryville from Route 7. Where do I see that marker that the Confederate soldiers put up?
Yeah.
Right, is it right outside of town?
Yeah, so I should have put up a modern image, so that's partially on me. So the core kind of built environment has expanded beyond what is shown on this Hotchkiss map, of course, but it is going to be kind of out. It's placed in this area. I don't have a great way of showing it because I don't have the modern map on the screen there, but it is pretty much where that core of the fighting is along the side of the road. Yeah.
But where, Route 7 or Route 7?
Yeah.
Route 7.
Yeah, well, catch me after the talk, I'll bring up Google Maps, and I think that would be a better way to. Yes, thank you, Thomas.
Another question, Mississippi boys, they seem to be all over the place in this war. I think a number of them are buried in Eastern Cemetery in Leesburg. Is it some of the same folks?
Brian's giving me a thumbs up, so yes. Yeah, I'm not super familiar with the Leesburg stuff, but I'll spot. Yeah. Okay, so yes, it's the same cluster of Mississippi regiments. Yes.
When Anderson returns to Petersburg, is that primarily at his request or at Lee's request?
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, Anderson in his end of 64 report doesn't specifically say it. There's a lot, I think it's a lot of both. There's some pressure from Lee. If you're not doing anything with that division of infantry, it sure would be nice to have here. And on top of that, having Anderson hating the concept of spending any more time adjacent to Jubal A. I think it's a fairly mutual thing. And it's important to note that when Kershaw comes back to the valley, Anderson doesn't.
Early Anderson holding some structure outside of Baltimore, I believe. That's supposed to be very vulnerable to an advance.
Repeat the question, we can't hear it.
Yeah, so that was a question about early leaving Anderson with some earthworks around Halltown. For that, I kind of want to punt to Scott, because I don't know much about Halltown. Not to put you on the spot.
Around August 25th and 26th, Early's going to leave Anderson with Kershaw at Halltown in front of Harper's Ferry, but basically Sheridan's entire army is there at that point. And Early's dashing off towards the Potomac River towards Shepherd's house to try to stir things up. And Sheridan doesn't take offensive operations, and Kershaw and Anderson are lucky at that point. All they do is they capture about 100 men from one of the South Carolina regiments on the big line.
Doesn't they contribute from that state to the irrigation in the city?
Generally, I think Anderson wrote something about, or one of the staff officers wrote something about, it seemed like whenever they got together, then Early would move off to some other corner of the valley and had a hard time getting true coordination and cooperation.
I'm sorry, that's all the time we have for questions. How about another round of applause? Before we break for the next speaker, I've had a lot of questions today about our good friend Nick Paserno. So many of you know Nick. Nick has been just a bulwark in our field for so many years. And everybody knows that he's struggling with some health issues right now, and some very, very serious ones. And I'm pleased to tell you that if you look right back here, it's Mr. Nick Paserno. Nick, why don't you come down here? All right.